Edward Drinker Cope was one of the most talented and prolific naturalists of the 19th century. He published more than 1,400 articles and books and named more than 1,000 new species, including this one, Hypsibema crassicauda, North Carolina's only homegrown dinosaur. Cope was best known, however, for his feuds. Cope's most infamous feud was with rival paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh. This fight was both epic and petty. No one really knows how the feud started, but its final act was played out publicly on the front pages of the New York Herald in 1890. Envious of his rival's federal financial support, Cope recruited a hack journalist to write a series of articles aimed at destroying Marsh's reputation. Marsh responded with a catalog of Cope's many errors. Both emerged from the Herald scandal with their reputations badly soiled, although Marsh suffered most when he lost his lucrative federal subsidy in 1892. Less well known was Cope's unfortunate feud with his closest friend, Percifor Frasier. Frasier, a geologist at the University of Pennsylvania, was Cope's ally at Philadelphia's museums and learned societies. Cope had written a letter to Frasier, allegedly calling some of his statements false and untrue. Stung by Cope's words, Frasier wrote back, asking Cope if he really meant to say mistaken. Cope held firm, ignoring his friend's pleas. When the two of them met at an American Philosophical Society meeting in 1888, Frasier confronted Cope at the door, asking him, "Do you characterize what I wrote as falsehood?" When Cope tried to brush him off, Frasier slapped him hard in the face, twice. The two of them then grappled for several anxious minutes before a mutual friend intervened. The blow-by-blow details of this fistfight were drawn from a memo Frasier wrote the following day. Fortunately, Cope and Frasier were later able to patch up a peace. Cope's final feud was with Chicago's Field Museum and its first director, Frederick J.V. Skiff. In the 1890s, natural history museums were booming in the United States. The Field Museum, for example, which opened in 1894, was founded with the material aid of some of Chicago's wealthiest business tycoons. And though it had a specific mandate to pursue research, its first appointed director was a businessman with no scientific training or museum experience. Cope felt strongly that science institutions should be run by scientists. In 1895 and 1896, he aired his differences with Skiff and the Field Museum in a pair of caustic editorials in the American Naturalist, a journal he owned and edited. He wrote, "In Europe, competent scientific men manage museums. In America, they do not. Chicago begins in this matter at the bottom of the ladder. Men who have spent their lives in mercantile pursuits are generally unacquainted with the conditions necessary to original research in science. And no museum can become great unless its administration is in control of scientific experts." Cope's editorials were ineffective. His health declined rapidly and he died in April 1897. Skiff would remain director of the Field Museum until his death in 1921. Cope's complaints would follow Skiff to the grave, however, as his New York Times obituary noted, "Dr. Skiff was one of the first museum administrators who was not a scientific man, and he met with considerable opposition in the beginning." Edward Drinker Cope was a prototypical gentleman scientist, self-funded and extremely self-confident. American science in the 19th century, however, was shifting from a private pursuit of the wealthy to a profession responsible to those who provided the funding. Cope, a hard-boiled and fiercely independent scientist, operated by his own set of ideals. The transition of science from private to public was likely inevitable, and few Cope-like scientists exist today. While controversy and contentiousness continue, public fistfighting, mercenary journalism, and institutional slander are things of the past.